Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ann Schaefer. I'm one of the organizers of the Baltimore Fine Art Print Fair. And it's my honor today to introduce our speakers. Shelley Langdale is a friend of mine from way back. She's the curator and department head of modern, do you do contemporary?
Yeah.
Modern and contemporary prints and drawings at the National Gallery down in Washington. And she's going to converse with Phil Sanders, who you probably have seen around because he's been giving tours all weekend. And if you took a tour, you'll know that there's nobody better to do it because he's not only a scholar, but also a maker. So he comes from both sides. So they're gonna just, have at it, and we'll see what they say. I'm excited because I love the ins and outs of the museum, the back, how does it work? How does it happen? So we're gonna learn, all of us together. All right, you ready?
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're good to go.
I think we are good to go.
All right, so Phil, should we just start with how would you like to start?
For me, I think it's really a good idea for people to get a bit of background and how a museum works a little bit as far as acquisitions are concerned. Sure. So they can understand when you start to show them images and acquisitions, better understand the importance of what it is that you've been doing since you've gotten to the National Gallery. And I think it's important to let people know that you arrived at the National Gallery
in May of 2019.
Right, so not too long before the pandemic began, which really, in and of itself, ushered in a lot of additional change, which we'll talk about too. But I think for most people, I think it's important to understand where, how you look at the collection as a whole, and then how you look at, especially this being the nation's collection, how you look at how that collection is intended to serve the public.
Well, yes, that's a big topic. But to start, one thing I'll say that's been really interesting for me is because I've worked at 5 different collections of various sizes. I had an internship at the FOG at the Harvard University Art Museums. I worked at the MFA Boston, which has one of the largest collections in the country. I think somewhere around 400,000 works on paper. Then I was at Cleveland, where they had about 20,000 works on paper, and then I was in Philadelphia where they had 160,000 works on paper, and now I'm back with a similar sized collection at the National Gallery. And I think one of the things that's important about prints and drawings collections is that they often cover the entire museum's collection. So they'll cover 500 years of works of art, not just Italian Renaissance paintings or modern and contemporary paintings and sculpture. So I think the first order of business is always to get a handle on sort of where the strengths and weaknesses lie of a given collection, and that's always dependent on the various generous donors that have donated to the institution over the years. You might have somebody, we have a wonderful collection from the Jacksons of fabulous late 19th and early 20th century French prints and posters, for example.
Exactly.
We were very fortunate as our founding father at the National Gallery to have a tremendous gift of tens of thousands of prints by Lessing J. Rosenwald, who collected very ecumenically, I would say, from early 15th century engravings to what would have been in his day a contemporary work by Jasper Johns of 1960.
Right.
I think sort of getting a handle on that first, and then seeing, where are there holes in trying to tell the story of printmaking, both in the United States and sort of history as a whole. And for example, one of the things, it's always interesting, and there are always surprises. Think, the National Gallery of Art, they must have a really strong American, collection. It's the nation's collection. But we have no Provincetown prints, hardly. 1 or 2, which is of course, the wonderful color printmaking, woodcuts that largely a number of women artists made in the early teens and 20s through the early 30s around Provincetown, Massachusetts. So, there's always something that, because of serendipity just got left out.
Yeah, for a wide variety of reasons. And one of the other things that we've talked about a bit as well is how you've also started looking at what's in the other collections and Washington, D.C.
Yes.
as well. So and me having been in New York City for so long, you'll see certain things that are represented at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, as well as the Whitney Museum of Art. And you think that's a lot of resources spent on the same image to be in 3 places in the same town.
Right.
And one of the things I really appreciated that we've talked about your approach being is, if it's at another institution in your town, it's not necessary for you to maybe rebuy that, but to then expand into another part to tell a fuller story.
Yeah. No, I think one of the things, as you alluded to, that's really shifted in the last couple of years, of course, is I think everybody is taking a deeper look at, it had already started, but now is more in earnest, is taking a look at the demographics of our collections. We have certainly left out women for many, many years, and people of color and LGBTQIA artists and so forth. So we are really trying to consciously figure out where our biggest holes are and how we can begin to broaden our areas of collecting. And so in doing that, interestingly, in the 21st century, we're also hitting a moment of crisis with storage, because we've all been collecting now throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. So we also have to think about that. And I think that's one of the things that led me to be more conscious of reaching out to my colleagues at the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian American Art Museum or the Hirshhorn. And it's not that we would never collect the same thing. There might be a reason, a really strong reason that we want this particular print because it relates to something else in the collection and we wouldn't want to have to borrow it to do that. But in general, as I'm looking at an artist, I have been reaching out to say, all right, well, what do you guys have? Because I should probably focus on trying to broaden the representation of this artist in our region, because if people want to study this artist, we want to be able to offer the broadest range of works by them and really show a broader range of their artistic practice.
And it also highlights that it's not about competition amongst institutions, which I think in the past there has been some kind of quiet competition between institutions, whereas right now it's really more about saying this work that is needed to be added to the collection to fill big gaps is more expensive and there's limited funds, and so it's how are you going to use those resources
and limited storage space. How are you
going to use those resources in the smartest way that creates the greatest benefit to the community as a whole.
Right. Well, and I think a lot of that sort of mindset grew with, as artists have been exceeding the bounds of small objects and things and media. So, it's certainly, a lot of institutions now have started jointly buying videos, for example, or other kinds of digital works that can exist in 2 copies in different places with lots of restrictions and limitations on how they can be shown, but it makes them more affordable.
Right, so the challenges that we've talked a lot about over the years that you have is that it's not just about storage or even the money, but it's also about the story that you're going to tell with the collection, like what that collection visibly represents. And being at the nation's capital comes with other restrictions and other considerations, because your institution, every institution has its own politics. It also is in Washington, D.C., which has its own politics laid on top.
And we are a federal institution. We are not a private institution.
Exactly. And so there's the gymnastics that curators have to go through in order to acquire work is often one of the most unseen and unknown parts of the job. And I think we can kind of segue into this, into some of those early things when you first got to the National Gallery, you were able to add to the collection that some of you may not have ever known existed. I didn't know until we had a conversation at the very beginning of 2020.
And since we are at an art fair, I will also say that another important, I think you will hear a lot when you talk to master printers, when you talk to curators, when you talk to artists about prints and drawings being a very collaborative field. And part of that too, and one of the reasons that I always encourage, and I encouraged my interns to come to this fair, is because of that generosity and collaboration too. I mean, we work very closely with a lot of dealers who are equally scholars and collectors often as well. And they know that we're working on a project, or they'll keep their eye out for things, or even if they don't have it and they heard some other dealer has it and they're working on something that relates to a project or a research that you're doing, they'll connect you. So that sort of leads into my first acquisition, which is I was at my first print fair with my National Gallery cap on in fall of 2019, and I was going around the booths, and Anders Bergstrom, who I know very well, who has work on view here at Dolan Maxwell. He also has a second hat and works at Hauser and Wirth, and I was struck by these etchings that were hanging in his booth by Eva Hesse, and I never knew. I knew Eva Hesse as an innovative, amazing sculptress and installation artist, and an incredible draftsman, actually. Never knew that she made prints, and was really, really taken with these. And the more I looked at them, the more I realized how much they spoke to her early, her concerns that stuck with her throughout her life. These are both etchings and aquatints that she made when she was a student at Yale in 1958, so she was quite young. But she, you can already see some of her sensibility for sort of vulnerable, fragile kinds of structures. Particularly, I know it's hard to see in this, but you'll have to trust me that on the one on the left, there are these...
You'll have to come visit them at the
Well,
National
yeah, you
Gallery.
can come visit them at the National Gallery, but there are these incredible wiry dry point lines that are just exquisite. And I'm just showing you. So this is what we had. We had an early lithograph, this beautiful drawing that she was making right after she graduated from Yale, fabulous collaged color drawing that she made in '64, and she really made drawings throughout her career, really working on compositions, but just sort of general ideas, not really studies for specific things so much. And then on the right, I thought this is part of why I loved that first etching that I pointed you to. We have this one installation piece, this sculpture, if you will, called Contingent. It was related to another project from 1969, and you can already see like the edges of that fabric, how gentle and they emulate. There's a real similarity or resonance with those delicate lines that you see in the etching, and the translucency of the fabric as well. But what most stuck in my mind was one of Eva's most well-known early relief works, Metronomic Irregularity, which Lucy Lepard included in a really groundbreaking show in the 1960s. And it was that kind of wiry sort of threads that are connecting these two solid forms that made me really think of the connection with this early etching.
And those are small works.
Yeah, they're pretty small. They're like 12 by 18 inches. So this etching's this big, but the sculptures are not that much bigger.
So when you look at that print, for the print nerds out there,
yes,
there's a lot of work going on in that plate. There's a lot of time spent with that etching. It's an extreme labor to create that level of delicacy and translucency that went into that. So you can really, I mean, this isn't an artist who just kind of haphazardly went at it and had a test. This was a serious dive into a process for a student.
Well, and I really think, I got very interested. She only made about maybe somewhere between 30 and 40 prints, and almost none of them she printed in more than 2 or 3 impressions at the most. So they really were almost drawings, but for her. I mean, that was sort of how she was using them. She was interested in the mark making that she could get out of this technique. And I think that also is just an interesting aspect. And this is, I tried to show you a close-up. This is really hard to see as well, so you'll really have to come and look at them. You can make an appointment anytime. But the deep patches there are not just aquatint or tone. There's very laboriously worked with line. So again, to Phil's point, this is something that she really dived into and laboriously worked on.
And I always, I generally talk a lot about printmaking as being a sculptural mindset that has a two-dimensional output, because we take things apart, we put them back together. There's this real physical way of interacting, especially in intaglio printing, because it's that physicality of the plate. And so there's all this, you can tell from a practitioner's perspective, that time spent and that sculptor's modality, that her way of working in print was really reminiscent of the way in which she approached her aesthetics and process in sculpture.
Yeah.
That kind of parts coming together, and also that working through things, which
Yeah.
is very much a part of her sculptural practice.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And the other thing that I loved about this one was if you look at it long enough, space starts to move back and forth. The positive space, the white space can be positive or negative, depending on how long you look at it. It really starts to move back and forth between the two modalities. And then this was the real clincher for me, was just how, this is one of her very famous pieces that is owned by the Whitney Museum of American Art from 1970. So this is 12 years after she made the print.
Yeah.
But you can see just how she's thinking spatially in very similar ways. So we were talking a little bit about sort of exploring the demographics of our collections. And in doing so at the National Gallery, I was surprised to learn that the earliest print we had by a Black artist that came into the collection by a Black artist was this incredible work on the right. This is an engraving that's this big. Okay?
Engraving.
It really, it's actually bigger than that, what you're actually seeing on the screen, which is unusual. And it's an incredible, it's a tour de force of engraving. It's just a phenomenal plate. It must have been a phenomenal plate. Norma Morgan is a Black artist who studied with Stanley William Hayter in his shop in 1950 in the States. And I'm showing you on the left a print that was acquired by my predecessor, Judith Brody, in 2010, that is the only known impression of a print that she made in Hayter's shop. And it looks, you could mistake it for a Stanley William Hayter. Ann Schaefer's the expert, and that's okay.
Well,
because
I mean, and I just want to point
Yes.
out, it wasn't only like Norma would make work that looked like Hayter. Virtually every artist that came in has their Hayter-esque print. Like Jackson Pollock has a Hayter-esque print. And it was his way of engendering experimentation by pushing someone into this mode of making a work. And Zarina Hashmi is famous for saying when she worked with Hayter that was her student period. That's where she learned how to be who she was. But all of that work she kind of cast aside because she needed to make work in this mode to learn who she was. It was part of Hayter's like magic as a teacher. And so you can really see that in Norma's print, how she adopted the mode of Hayter, and then where that leads her as an artist is so phenomenal.
It's sort of, you could think about it as parallel to going to, the traditional academy, right, where you work through all your anatomical drawings. Right. Only this is the abstract equivalent of that. Exactly. You're learning how to make textures, you're learning how to use different kinds of printmaking tools, you're learning how to do crazy things like screen print color onto a plate before you print it, which she probably did here. So there's lots of different things that she learned, but what I love about having both of these is being able to either show in an exhibition or show to classes when they come to the study room how that process of working in Hayter's style and learning from him translates into these realistic landscapes that she became so well known for. Because if you just sort of squeeze your eyes a little bit, you can really appreciate the abstractness of those incredible cliffs, and the line work. If you come, again, you're gonna have to come in so you can really get your nose into it and see the incredible line work that define the foliage and the contours of the rocks. But it very readily developed her hand for her own very distinctive form of working and style.
I mean, I just want to point out that's like almost a 40-inch tall sheet.
Yeah.
Like that's a massive engraving on any standards, let alone something that has this kind of gesture and freedom that's associated with it.
It easily would have taken a month or more.
Yeah, I mean, it probably took a lot more. I mean, just even in because there is the aquatint tones that are in there too to kind of help push and pull a little bit of the tone, but there's a line work in all of that aquatint. So it's her dedication to engraving in a time period where engraving was very much out of fashion unless you were in kind of that Hayter-Lazansky school of gesture, right? Using engraving in a very different way. In this case, this is kind of more of a nod to traditional engraving, right? And no one was doing that at this time, especially at this kind of scale.
And she was a real master at it.
Yes, one of the best.
And this was done in 1956, and Rosenwald acquired it in 1959, so it would have been a contemporary work for him to acquire. And I was very proud to learn that we had something by a black artist in 1959. That was a good, and by a woman.
By a woman, which is
So
rare on both accounts.
I felt a little, we still have a long way to go, but that was a better start than I had anticipated I might discover. So that's one of the wonderful things about having, 100,000 plus objects is there's always new things to learn.
Well, and I also like to point out too that the print collections are generally the first area of an institution to collect a younger artist or collect more diversely. And a lot of it has to do with prints are cheaper, prints are easier to store, and it's easier to sneak them in the back door. So the curators in the print departments can kind of slip stuff in that may not necessarily hit the radar if it was a giant sculpture or a giant painting that everyone's going to hear about. So there's been this kind of long tradition of the print departments being the ones being willing to be more pioneering and more out there and recognizing quality work from a wider array of artists.
Well, and that's actually really interesting for the National Gallery because Anne may know this. I didn't know this until I came to work there, but the museum didn't collect work by contemporary artists. They had to have been dead for 25 years until we opened the IMP wing.
Wow.
So, but we had this. So there was, and part of that, this is a really crazy thing that it has a lot to do with terminology. And it turns out, I didn't ever realize this, but technically the print and drawing department is not part of the permanent collection as defined in the laws in the charter of the National Gallery, because the permanent collection were things that were on the walls, on view all the time. So that was how this kind of stuff could slip in because it didn't fall under those parameters.
Right. So you guys are getting yet another clue into some of the strange particular nature of institutional collecting, and that's a really nice loophole that was exploited.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And it is one of the reasons that the bulk of our diverse, the most diverse collections, as you said, are pretty much always in the works on paper departments, photography too.
Right.
So the other works that I was able to collect, thank goodness, before Amos passed away in 2020, right when I got there in 2019, Emma was an artist whose work I had greatly admired. She's now, fortunately, she just had the benefit of her first major retrospective that was organized by the Georgia Museum of Art and then traveled to Philadelphia, where I had lobbied for it before I left. And it went to also, I think, to the to the Proctor Institute? There was one other venue.
I think so.
Anyway. And so she's now much better known than she was, but she was really quite a prolific printmaker. And also an artist that combined all kinds of media including weaving and so forth. And one of the things I've been really conscious about doing is when we have nothing by an artist, I think we had one print by Emma that was part of a portfolio that Curly Raven Holton, a well-known master printer, had produced at his experimental printmaking workshop at Lafayette College. But that was all we had, and I really wanted to take the opportunity because her prints were made in small numbers. There weren't a lot of them out there, and I knew the show was coming,
Right.
and that she was going to become better known, and so I wanted to get a range of works across her career. So,
and she had a dedicated print practice over time.
Yes.
It wasn't like she made one or two prints here or there. Printmaking was an integral part of her practice as an artist throughout her whole career.
Unlike Eva Hesse,
Exactly.
who was sort of experimented early on and incorporated some of those ideas into her work later on, Emma continually revisited printmaking in different media, combining it with other processes. So the earliest work that I got by her is this fabulous, it's actually a self-portrait called Gold-Faced Type. Emma was one of a number of artists who really explored the different tonalities of brown that constitute people of color, and hence the title. And one of the things that I really loved about this is she was fairly young, 1966, so she was like 29. And she had come to New York after graduating from Antioch College and a stint at the London School of Art in printmaking. She landed in New York in the early 60s, was the first and only female member of the important Black Artists Collective Spiral, which you may have heard of, which was founded in 1963 around the time of the March on Washington, specifically to debate abstract versus figurative work and which could best serve the civil rights movement. And Emma always joked that the real reason that she was the only woman artist in the group was because Faith Ringgold and Camille Billups were too opinionated, and the guys did not want to have anybody perhaps who was so seasoned and opinionated, and she was, you know, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and could be easily influenced and not take over too much. But nonetheless, she holds that important role. But what I love about this is, I mean, to me, this is very much a self-portrait of a young artist. It's screen print, very much a 60s medium, revived from the 1930s WPA era. It has that sort of pop primary color palette to it, but it's also painterly. It has some of that, you were talking about sort of being like Lee Krasner and some of the other.
Like Elaine de Kooning and Marisol, where there's this really beautiful gestural quality to the screen prints they were doing at that time.
Yeah.
And it has a real reminiscence of its period of painterly screen print.
Yeah, you can see they're not like totally solid, flat, commercial type color. But I'm just showing it here with a painting by one of the women pop artists, Belgian women pop artists, to give you sort of a sense of visually how that resonates with some of the contemporary pop images that were out there, works that were out there. But this was the really striking thing to me. After I had decided that I wanted to get this, I discovered this Ebony magazine cover from the same year, from 1966. And I had thought, in seeing the screen, that it reminded me of those sort of, it has kind of a coy sort of pose to it, and it looks like, the Breck hair commercials or something that you would see in magazines. And sure enough, I found this cover where there's this whole sort of montage of women in similar kinds of smiling poses. But the title of the article was a little controversial. It was called "Are Negro Girls Getting Prettier?" And one of the things about all of the women on that on the magazine cover and Emma's portrayal of herself is she has straightened hair. And inside after I looked up, and there were a couple of letters that came to Ebony magazine that were not so happy with the title of that piece, and there was of course that tension between conforming and really celebrating natural hair that was a big part of the civil rights movement in that moment. But I think it's interesting because she's low down in the frame and sort of, it's a pretty modest self-portrait, I would say.
Yeah.
So then I found, this was the other great self-portrait that I bought at the same time. Now it's 12 years later, after spending most of the 60s as a textile designer. She actually did a craft show for PBS. She got a master's in education. She was just sort of trying to find her way, which was not easy for a black woman artist in the 60s to get gallery representation. But she managed to show here and there and kept at her work. And then in 1980, she got her 10-year faculty position at Rutgers. So this is a real moment sort of where she's secured, a good job, an important job at an important art school. She's got her hand on her hip and she's looking at you. She's not so much receiving your gaze as staring you down. And there were two things that I loved about this. One is that if you're a print nerd like we are, it's like a symphony in brown aquatint. It's very hard, again, as you know from looking at real things all day, it's very hard to convey the nuances and subtlety of tone across that are represented in this print. And of course, I hope you also recognize these incredible patterns that she's included in the mat, in her suit, in the bush vegetation in the background that allude to her work as a designer, as a printmaker.
And I also want to point out, it's a big image.
Yeah,
it's 24 by 21. And working in aquatint at that scale always presents a lot of challenges. And the way in which she's handling it is not just to represent spatial depth and texture, but it's also to really convey like identity relative to color and racial identity relative to color. And so she's not she's trying not to step away. This wasn't printed in black, this was printed in brown. She's
Yes.
made sure that she stenciled off the head
towel,
wrap
yeah.
so that was bright white, right? So that there was that stark contrast to the world. So there's all these little decisions that are being made at this time, you know, of someone who has, you know, gotten a sense of security as an artist for the first time with her job. And I just want to point out, you know, she became department head and like is really responsible for the
Yeah.
growth of that program at Rutgers in so many positive ways too.
Well, and during the 70s, she was a member of the feminist literary publication Heresies with Lucy Lippard. So, I mean, she had gained a real sense of self as a black woman, too. And what was one of the things that struck me about this image was that it was basically a manifestation of two very well-known mantras from from the civil rights movement: black is beautiful, and the personal is political.
Exactly.
And I think this print really embodies both of those ideas very strongly.
But as you're going to show, it's
Yeah.
also taking on that European trope or theme of the bather, which
Yes.
is very common, and it's a very white
Yes.
theme.
Yes, and that's the other thing too, that, you know, I'm about to just quickly run through some classic bathers from ancient times, this Iron Age figurine of a bathing woman, you know, 16th century Italian, Rembrandt, Degas, Renoir, but look at how they are designed really to be looked upon rather than to be looking at you. And so she really has taken on this, you know, major art historical subject and flipped it on its head. The other thing I'll just say is here you can see a little bit of the sort of subtleties of tone, how she's like defined her clavicle, and it's gorgeous. And you can see the real difference now between the earlier and the later self-portrait. But I think too, just that the other noticeable thing to me as a woman is she also didn't overly endow herself. This is herself. This is what she looks like. She's not trying to be a pinup girl. She's just very confident with who she is.
And one of the nice parts about what you were doing with collecting this body of work over time is that you're essentially able to tell a story with the way in which you're selecting what to
Exactly.
purchase. So I think that's really an important part for people to understand about institutional collecting too. It's not necessarily about just getting an image to represent an artist, but it's also what's the story you're going to be able to tell
Right.
when you're not there.
Right.
And these images are in a drawer and someone looks up that artist and they can pull that out, and how that artist's story can be told through their work as
Right.
being a really important part of the legacy and purpose for institutional collecting.
Right. Well, and it's also hard. It's a lot to ask of any one print to represent an artist in their entirety of their artistic practice.
I think we can all agree with that.
Yes.
There's one image that you probably wouldn't want being the image that represents you, and if that's the one in a museum, you'd be like, oh, this is all anyone's ever going to know.
Right, right. Or that wasn't my best day.
Exactly.
So this was one of the other important things that I wanted to represent about Emma's work was she often would mix her media. So she would do paintings and include weavings as framework around the painting that she made, or she would collage things into her prints, or collage things onto her other things onto her paintings. And so but since I work with works on paper, I had to stick within those parameters. And this was this wonderful, as far as I know, unique example where she took a print that she made for a portfolio that was printed and published by Robert Blackburn's workshop that was all black artists in 1974, and they were all black and white prints. An allusion actually to Spiral's only show, which was also all done in black and white. And called American Girl, which is a phenomenal print in and of itself, with lots of allusions to the American flag and oppression and all kinds of things. But anyway, I'm hoping, as I said to Phil, I'm hoping this was a bad proof or something that she tore up and included in what you might think is a collage, but this is actually handmade paper. So what she did is she took, I don't know how many of you are familiar with making paper, but she made a slurry of paper pulp in a frame that you use to create sheets of paper, and she cut out and put the pieces of the print into that slurry of paper. She used paper pulp to draw the red area and the gray areas that look linear, and then it dried and formed into a sheet of paper. So this is actually handmade paper. And you can see she's recreated both through positive and negative form different sexually posed women. So possibly some critique on that and a revisiting, because this was done in 1981 and the print was done in 1974. And that's another important thing that Phil and I have been talking about on and off, is how, particularly for Black artists, they often made initially only small numbers of works when they were working in the 60s, 50s, 40s, and earlier, because there weren't huge markets to sell them. And they would then, Bob Blackburn particularly, among others, said, oh, you still have those plates? Let's print some more in the 90s or the 80s.
Right, and that was one of the things we were talking about, is one of those first institutional governance and directorship changes really occurs in the 90s, one of the big overturns. And you start seeing that's when institutions kind of first wave of being like, wow, we have really missed the boat on collecting so many diverse voices in this country over the last 50, 60 years. And you start seeing institutions trying to fill some gaps and trying to make up for lost time. And especially, and Bob Blackburn, the printmaking workshop, started bringing out old blocks from other artists. So Hale Woodruff is a really great example. He did this amazing suite, the Atlanta series, in the 30s, that he only printed a few impressions because it was so overtly graphic about Jim Crow as a continuation of slavery in the South, that it would have gotten him in, threatened his own personal safety, his life, for those images. So he only ever printed a few, but the blocks, he kept all the blocks. They were restruck in the mid-90s and then immediately went into like collections at the Whitney and the Met.
We have a collection.
You have a set because there was this recognition at that time that, you know, this was good work, it needs to be redone, but there was also pervading the printmaking workshop that an idea doesn't ever have to be done. You can always revisit it, and Bob Blackburn, with his own personal work, would revisit the same set of wood blocks that he made in 1960, again in 1970, again in the 80s, again in the 90s, and show how that idea can evolve and change over time as life and experiences changed. And so really a lot of the artists who came through the printmaking workshop, and Emma was one of the artists who spent a lot of time working at the printmaking workshop, they really embodied that malleability and that ability to go back and remake. And so this to me is one of those kind of great examples of how the environment that she was working in really gave her a different level of creative freedom. I mean, became commonplace in the places she worked.
Well, and she was from Georgia, as was Hale Woodruff. And although he was not so interested in her before she went on and showed up in New York, when she arrived in New York, he was the one who sort of connected her with Spiral. So there's lots of crossovers. And I should say, my colleague, Mary Lee Corlett, who is here, is working on an Elizabeth Catlett show, and she is another major printmaking artist who really revisited things and reused them and changed, used them for different meaning as things changed over time and experiences changed over time.
Who also was heavily influenced by Bob Blackburn and the printmaking workshop as well. So that particular environment, for those of you that don't know, was founded in 1948, the printmaking workshop by Robert Blackburn, and it was generally an oasis for African-American artists, Afro-Caribbean artists, and expatriated Jewish artists from Europe after the Second World War, because they couldn't have work anywhere else in the city. And so this print shop became this place where it didn't matter who you were or where you were from, but you could come, and it was really more about the work you made. Right? So all these conversations that we talk about with spiral, figuration versus abstraction, all that stuff came out of and grew through this communal printmaking environment. So when you look at an art fair like this, and we're constantly talking about the collaborative process, a lot of our modern conception of the collaborative process of printmaking was being developed in that workshop at that time. And those ideas were then spinning and spiraling out.
And grew out of WPA too. A lot of them met in the WPA, and
because Bob Blackburn modeled the printmaking workshop off of Augusta Savage's Harlem Community Arts Center, which she developed as a multi-generational, multi-racial education for artists of all types. So she is largely unrecognized for all the work she did in creating that concept.
Yes, definitely. So this is so now we've moved from the 80 to 92 with Emma. One of her interests or sort of conscious efforts was to sort of take on some of the imagery of some of the male artists that were receiving lots of attention, like Jasper Johns, hence the target subject. And you'll also notice that there's a picture in the background. This is where she collaged and did photo transfers that were often included in her prints, often working with Kathy Caraccio, also a very important printmaking workshop that was founded in 1977. Emma received a whole trove of old pictures from both her family and from a neighbor of hers that they were very close to, of Black life in the South in the 20s and 30s. And she used a lot of these images even though she didn't know who the people were. And so obviously the target takes on a very different tone when you have a Black man underneath
In the target.
in the center of the target. And the palette here is very pointedly taken to relate to the Pan-African flag. This is 1992, as Phil mentioned, David Hammond's famous flag of the United States done in African flag colors came out in 1990.
African American flag.
And there's the Jasper Johns target, just for comparison. And then it was very hard since in this moment when we were acquiring these and shortly after, you saw a lot of this flag and different iterations of the palette in the printout posters that you could print off the internet for the Black Lives Matter protests, and the Pan-African flag that was also carried in many of those. So she very much took on a direct political as well as sort of feminist point of view in
Right,
this.
and this was early 90s
Yeah.
she was doing this.
Yeah,
So
so-
just to kind of give a context of time too.
And then this is one of our favorites.
It's one of my favorites, yeah.
Using a carborundum print, printmaking technique, which was actually developed by the African-American artist Doc Thrash in a WPA printmaking workshop with other collaborators. Basically it's a mechanism for roughening the plate to get a tone so it will hold ink and have a nice tone to it. But what I love about this, it's called Crown. And I love all of the references and the sense of movement that she really gets, not only from the sort of energy of the line work, but also from the sort of more painterly elements above it. So I've read everything into this from like a ball of yarn looking at someone's head from the top, a dance skirt, a skirt that's being moved as someone's dancing. I just think it's a fabulous print, and if you are enamored of texture in prints, it's just a knockout.
Yeah, and for me, this is a really great kind of like bookend of the works in which you've collected, because it does have that, self-portraiture sort of reference to it. And when you look at them all in an arc with one another, you really see how she's been concerned with the same issues as an artist since the beginning, and the different ways in which she's gone about evolving and representing those same themes throughout her work over the years. And I think, that's kind of, to me, the point of institutional collections, is to be able to have that kind of story and that kind of arc, because otherwise, if we only ever saw this one image or only ever saw the first image, you would not really get an understanding of who she was as an artist and how that vision and voice carried over time, evolved over time, and how it can influence over time.
Right.
So for me, it's really great to be able to do this for her too, because I just want to point out she was able to buy this work before she passed.
Yeah.
So she knew it was going to happen. When so many artists who've made such great contributions don't actually get to know that their work ended up in that sort of a collection to where it would have that sort of a life. And so it's pretty rare for especially artists of color and women artists of her generation to actually get the recognition or actually know it's going to happen before they pass. So this was, to me, it was like really great that you were able to do that.
Yeah, no, I was thrilled, and I was glad that, I admired her work for a long time, so I was glad to have the opportunity to do it. And I should say that it was thanks to money that our collectors committee group donates that I was able to make that possible. And I should say too, I don't think I mentioned that this print, the American Girl print, is in the collection of the Library of Congress.
Right.
So
Yeah, that portfolio
it's nearby.
went.
Yeah. So that's a good.
I think that portfolio went with the printmaking workshop collection. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And if you're interested at all in some of the history and the visual history of the printmaking workshop, the Library of Congress in 2005 is when the sale was finalized, received over 2,200 prints from 1,800 different artists between 1948 and 1997 that worked at the printmaking workshop, which is by far still only a slice of the people involved. And some of Emma's prints were included in that collection as well. And something I want to point out with the particulars of that sale and why sometimes the details matter so much on these things is that it was stipulated that the purchase of that archive, which was intended to fill the void in the Library of Congress's collection of artists of color working in abstraction, because there was zero representation of that in the collection prior to that purchase, is that they couldn't just cherry pick the famous people. They had to get one print from every single artist that worked there, no matter if they were a Sunday painter to the most famous people. So like Romare Bearden or someone like M.F. Hussein was going to be right along someone that you may never know. And it was because the entire community, the entire environment was what was important. And so some of those portfolios were included in that purchase, and there's a lot of artists you may not be aware of that were in that. And so that particular purchase was such an important anchor to represent not just printmaking, but artists of many generations and many parts of the world who are all working in one environment together. So it's pretty rare.
Yeah, well, and the other thing I would just add is that portfolio, and I'm sure some of the others, I know a lot of them ended up going, I was always told, to like community centers and things too, and they got dissipated. So they, like, one print went here, one print went there. So there are very few that are around that are in their entirety, and that's really important
if memory serves, I believe Bob got an NEA grant to produce the portfolio, and it was intended to be disseminated to public institutions. I mean, was part of one with Rutgers, a similar portfolio for making prints to replace art lost in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, because all of that art was lost in on the post offices and the libraries, and so we worked with a series of New Orleans artists. So this is kind of a tradition that print can help replace or help, encourage a greater look at a community in those kind of public collections in that way. So print portfolios have often done that.
Yeah. Well, and just as a total something for totally different, I mean, the other thing we're trying to balance, we're always looking in filling gaps to think about important strengths in our collection too. And one of our great areas of strength is some of the early American modernists, particularly Georgia O'Keeffe. And we also have a good representation of Max Weber, two artists who were incredibly influenced by the teachings of Arthur Wesley Dow, who taught at the Columbia Teachers College. He taught summer classes in Ipswich, Massachusetts, primarily in color woodcut, but on the aesthetics overall called of Japanese aesthetics in particular. He was part of the arts and crafts movement. He was very interested in massing of light and dark, sort of abstracted forms that form a decorative composition, things like that. And he actually wrote an instruction manual called Composition, which was published in 1899, that was like the go-to book for teaching art all across the country for many, many years, and existed in many reprints. And we had nothing by him, not one thing. Well, I shouldn't say that. I guess we had one cyanotype photograph, but that isn't really what you think of when you think of Dow, and that isn't what would have really impacted Georgia O'Keeffe. So I finally got one print so that we now have something when we're teaching or when we're talking about Georgia O'Keeffe's work or showing her work. We have something to talk about in terms of influence.
Well, in that book too, influenced countless artists across the United States, who then influenced countless artists. So here's someone who had an integral impact on the rest of American art making for the next two generations, and to not have a representation of that in the national collection, right? So it's always like, where are you? I mean, like if you're like, the Museum of Modern Art in Oklahoma, it would be a different need. Like you wouldn't necessarily need this to help tell that story. And so where you are really does influence a lot of what you need to collect.
No, and he's too important to American art and too important. I mean, this is a modest print. It's only about this big. But it's really gorgeous, and it's his mature work where you really see the Japanese influence. Almost no two impressions are the same, and it's a beautiful American landscape.
And we should point out these are not cheap now.
No, they're not cheap, and they're not hard to find. I mean, they're very hard to find.
Right.
So, and that was the other interesting thing actually, is there was a major exhibition. I can't remember if it was in late 70s or actually 1980 of Arthur Wesley Dow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which was then the National Collection of the Fine Arts, I think. But major show, first ever retrospective of his work, and yet we didn't end up acquiring anything. So who knows why these things happen. But anyway, so yeah, so there's a balance. You're always trying to balance, sort of filling little holes like this that relate to strengths and building on strengths, certainly, and filling other kinds of gaps.
And in some ways being beholden to funds and donors and trying to find the people who have the work and understand the value of it going to a national collection versus an auction house, right? So there's a lot of different parts and pieces that curators have to deal with that are not just doing research, making a great show, putting it up on the wall. There's all these moving parts that go on behind the scenes so that we can just take something for granted.
Well, and along those lines, a lot of people don't realize about the National Gallery of Art that there's an assumption that, we're federally funded, we have tons of money, but the money from the government does not go to acquisitions at all.
It's operations.
It's all operations and the building and all of that. The idea, basically, Andrew Mellon, who set up the National Gallery with the government, was sort of the philosophy of if you build it, they will come. And the idea was that the public part of this was supposed to be that people would donate works to belong to the nation, and that would be our go-to sale line, was that you should give back. We've provided this place, and you can share it with the nation. We're free. You don't have to pay to get in, so everybody can see your collection. And we have had incredible generosity from many, many people. But that also, you can't let just gifts shape your collection, or it might be a little, I think that's
skewed.
how we get holes and
Well, yeah, that's how you get, so if you have to rely solely on a donation, then you're relying on that person's personal sensibilities, that person's lens that they saw the world through, what they valued and did not value, right? So when you think of older generations of white men who didn't necessarily have a value of female artists or artists of color and didn't collect it as that work.
Well, and there's
so then
also,
you don't get it when you get the gift.
Although even we are looking at a lot of that, because a lot of male white men's names are on these gifts, but it was actually their wives who were collecting a lot of things too, or it was the wives' money that they inherited that gave the men the opportunities to buy things. So yes, thank goodness for donors. We have, tremendous gifts. Rosenwald probably being the largest, but as I referred to, the Jacksons, we've had Gemini donates their archive. Catherine Brown's been giving us things from Crown Point Press. So it's just that it always has to be a combination so that you can be sure to tell the full story.
Right. And I want to reiterate that because maybe you missed that Gemini's complete archive of the work they've done since 1966, Catherine Brown with Crown Point Press. These are major contributions to contemporary printmaking. Artists at the time who are famous now that were unsaleable, like Richard Serra is probably the prime example. When Gemini first started working with Richard Serra, he was unsaleable. Like they couldn't give those prints away. And now there's some of the most important works by a sculptor working in print. And so it's that dedication that these publishers have had that has been recognized by the National Gallery over this long arc of time. And now that's part of the national collection and the national story, which is really rare, and it's a unique and important thing to then put in context with all of the other prints that are being made. So you have different parts of the country. That's all West Coast,
Right.
And what we've been talking about is mostly been East Coast.
Right, and with Crown Point, they have an archive at the Legion of Honor Museum in San Francisco, so there's sort of a West Coast archive and an East Coast archive. But we're tremendously, we have a really phenomenal collection of that period of time of printmaking because of those archives. So, and I think that's the other thing too, is they were two of the earliest print workshops in the so-called American printmaking Renaissance that started at the end of the 50s with ULAE. And so now I'm also, in this moment, I'm looking at how do I fill in the other workshops that were, that have been left out of the story. How do I tell, we tend to talk about the big boys, but what about, Segura Press or Coronado Press in Texas, or Brandywine Workshop in Philadelphia, Bob Blackburn. But we have such a great foundation to build out from because of those archives.
And then that goes back to your earlier point of that becomes a place to collect because it makes sense versus trying to go into a zone that you have no representation of right now. Does it make sense to commit a bunch of money and resources to try to collect this other thing when you could tell this story better by filling it out more?
Right. Well,
Like, so-
and just like, one of the areas that, we will be expanding in is, as we're looking more globally, is, we might collect more contemporary work by Japanese artists,
Right.
contemporary, but we're not going to go back and collect 19th and 18th century
Century.
Japanese prints because the Smithsonian Asian Art Museum is across the mall.
Right.
So that doesn't really make
And
sense.
they've got all of it. And they have great examples.
Exactly. But I know we're going
That's
low on
true.
time, so we're going to quickly, one of the other major acquisitions that I'm very, very proud of is a group of works by John Wilson, who's an African-American artist who's about to have a major retrospective. And I first did a show of his work in 1994 at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts with another artist, Joe Norman, also from Georgia. Well, now he's based in Georgia. But John was a really fascinating artist who is much lesser known, but followed a track not unsimilar to Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White and others, where except he grew up in Boston. He studied at the museum school, and then he went, as you can probably guess from looking at this beautiful gouache, watercolor on paper, to study with Leger in Paris. And he learned how to paint murals. But what I love about this, as much as you might say, oh, this looks very Leger-like, and it's sort of semi-abstraction and use of primary colors, but there's already hints of John here very much in my mind. He was such a humanitarian and always focused on the humanness of people and interactions between people, and the subtlety of that mother holding the baby on her lap is not probably something you would find, I don't think, in a Leger.
You would.
So I think he's already hinting at the direction that he would go in his subject matter, and it's a very skilled, very terrific composition. So that's one of his earliest works, and then he came back to the States. It was not a very pleasant time to be a Black American with a lot of the Jim Crow laws and so forth. And so one other place, this is the reason Elizabeth Catlett and Margaret Burroughs and Charles White and others ended up in Mexico, was because it was a more conducive environment to live in as a Black person. And so he went there. He met people from the TGP. He lived there for a few years, had one of his children there, and this is a lithograph from that period called The Trial, referring to the Scottsboro Boys trial, who were falsely accused of raping a white woman. Their trials and appeals went on for quite some time, and one actually wasn't even resolved until around this period, which is, I think, what prompted to do it. The original trials took place in the 30s. But it's a very powerful political piece. I think, both the strength of the figure who's standing up in his defense against what are clearly some rather haughty, biased judges, I think really carries forward his sense of politics.
Well, and the African American artists who congregated down to the Telegráfica Popular in Mexico City were largely making overtly political work, Elizabeth Catlett among them, and it was not safe for them as artists to make that work in the United States.
Yeah.
And so but they didn't want to stop making the work, and so by making it in print, it meant they could export that work back to the United States without the fear of violence against themselves living in the United States. So print was a major way in which these artists got to keep their voice active in the United States, but still being able to make the work that they wanted to make. And so Mexico City became that haven for artists working in print for that reason.
Well, and here I think the other thing I just want to point out is you can already see, particularly in the figure standing before the court, the real sculptural sensibility. One of the things about John that's so amazing to me in lithograph, in whatever medium he's working in, is this real sense of solid form, and also just his incredible love and sort of sensibility for both crayon and just tonalities, black tonalities, these really rich blacks and tones that he can pull out of
for the print geeks out there, he did most of that beautiful tone with a razor blade.
Yeah.
That's how you get that. If you've ever seen him in person, some of the impressions you can actually see a slight embossment from the depth of the cut of a razor blade. So on that leg, some of the impressions, you can actually see the paper puff just a tiny bit. So imagine drawing it dark and carving it back. So he was really treating the stone in a very sculptural format. He would scrape that stuff back in. And so he and Charles White in particular utilized the razor blade with extreme skill. That's one of the ways they actually drew most of their stuff. So.
And then these are two more direct Mexican subjects that he drew while he was there. Again, you can see what starts to happen is you can see him, we were talking about, how Norma Morgan sort of like you learn the language and then you sort of develop it into your own. So you really see that happening here. Obviously the left looking, you can see that he studied with Leger. There's definitely some of that abstract sort of semi-cubist composition to it. But then with Campesinos, you start to really see where John was going with these incredibly empathetic portrayals of humankind and human experience. And I love, and also you can see the influence of the Mexican muralists, those giant hands, the sort of the semi-abstraction, but the real empathy and this sort of pathos of the people's faces and physiognomies are what I feel is so distinctive to John.
And you can really, Leopoldo Mendez was one of the main leaders of the Telegráfico Popular, and as an artist, he trained under Posada, Jose Guadalupe Posada, and so you really get that. He really took that kind of caricature nature of Posada into that more direct, empathetic nature, and you can really see a lot of that too. And so there's a lot of influence. The artists at the Telegráfico Popular all had similar drive and vision, and they really kind of played off each other a great deal. And so Elizabeth Catlett, as her way of doing a lino cut was completely influenced by Mendez. And you can start to see how all those influences an artist gets, and we all know in the arts, you pick things up as you go, and that becomes, the soup that you're serving, so to speak. So you can really see that here, all of that influence of the workshop there in Mexico.
And then this was, these are promised gifts. Two very generous donors stepped up, and when I was pulling everything together, and I wanted all of it, and I couldn't narrow it down, but we couldn't quite get it all, they very generously stepped up to acquire these two drawing in a litho. The drawing relates to the litho. This incredible. It's about this big. It's pretty sizable. But just the repetition of the fist and the hand, being such an icon of the civil rights and black arts movement in the '60s, was just so amazing to me, and just how much he was studying the exact position and the fingers and the hand and which direction it was turning, and then this incredible. What I loved about the lithograph was really timeless. I mean, it really, in some ways, yes, you could guess that it was from the '60s, but the subject matter could be today. It could be, it's so universal, and that's really a key part of John's work as well. The other aspect of his work, as I said, I always try and get a group of things across the artist's interests and strengths. And this is a phenomenal lithograph of father and child. And one of the reasons I felt it was so important to get a subject where John was portraying a father and child is you don't see that very much. You see mothers and children all the time, but you see a family, but you almost never see father. And John was an incredible father. I knew him very, very well. And he had two daughters and a son, and was very involved in their lives, very involved in his grandchildren's lives. And I just love this sort of heroic image of the father, it's both a sort of protective arm and sort of a, I'm going to raise you above my station kind of arm. I'm giving you opportunity. I'm going to look after you and, send you forth in the world. And there's so much hope,
Yeah, and I mean, I want to point out something you guys might have missed in the notes, which is those first works you bought last summer, and in the buying has brought people out to donate to fill out, right? So sometimes it's like that initial action to say, hey, this is what we want to do, helps someone who has work say, okay, you're actually serious about doing this, and then add the rest on, right? So I think that's a really important distinction to make, is that you had made a commitment which helped bring other people along.
Right, and some donors too are really great about, like, I'll say, hey, I know you like this. Would you be willing to buy this and keep it in your house for a few years and then give it to us? And fortunately, Bob Stana also decided, and this relates to a fabulous sculpture that's at the community
And
college.
I've never seen that lithograph of John's.
Oh, really? Yeah.
No, I've never seen that
There's
one.
an incredible drawing too, but it's a phenomenal print. And he's done a number of father and children subjects. And then going to the Universal, this was key to me to acquire, is this study for his Eternal Presence sculpture, which resides on the grounds of the Museum of African American Artists in Roxbury, Massachusetts, which John also was involved in helping to found. And it comes from, I mean, it's a gorgeous drawing, that incredible contour. I love how that, sort of rippled line is so evocative.
Especially of way you make a lithograph.
Yes.
Like, I mean, those of you who've ever drawn with a lithocrayon, that's a classic litho move.
And yet, and very evocative of hair.
And that's big.
Yes, it's big. It's 45 inches tall. And the sculpture itself is about 7 feet. But it comes from when John was in Paris studying with Leger, he would spend a lot of time at the Musée Quai Branly, which is basically a historical museum of sculpture and objects from all over the world. And so he saw an Olmec head there. He was aware of the Easter Island heads. So he had started already in the 40s formulating this idea about the ideal sort of universal head of mankind, and hence the name Eternal Presence.
Right.
But he's drawing on across cultures to produce this. And Roz this is a very derivative version of a young woman that was a friend of one of his daughters, and he just loved her profile. And there are many, many images of Roz in different incarnations, some of them very specific where you can recognize her, and some of them a little more abstract like this. But again, that already with very few lines, you get that sense of the physicality of this sculpture.
Right.
And there it is, you can see sort of the size of it. And I wanted to mention one of the reasons I felt particularly strongly about, we had 2 prints by John in the collection, but he won the commission to do the sculpture of Martin Luther King in the hall of the Capitol, in the main hall of the Capitol, and it was the first sculpture by a black man to be, black artist to be included. And this is a great picture. I love this picture of Barack Obama, who stopped on Martin Luther King Day to sort of pay homage to the, but I love how, again, you see it's not your sort of standard portrait of a famous person. He's sort of looking down and engaging with you in
it's a presence
way. So yeah, so I think that's probably a good, we've talked over time.
We should open up if there are any questions.
Yes,
I want to make sure if there's a question
absolutely.
somebody has, that they get a chance.
But you get a sense of the range overall of how now this nicely, the last thing I should just say, sorry, I have to squeeze this one in. I also got this very famous study and then a series of full size, these are 77 inches tall pastel drawings of a series called Young Americans. This is his son, Roy. And this was done for a mural that he wanted to do, but never got a place he never found a place where he could execute it. And this was in 1975. He was teaching in Boston, where he taught for many years at Boston University, and never was able to this is part of the sad story of these artists that never quite got the recognition or the opportunity that they deserved, and he was a very devoted teacher. And it was not finding a way to bring this to fruition that turned him to sculpture.
Huh.
He gave up on the mural idea and turned to sculpture. Yale has a wonderful drawing that relates to a destroyed mural that he made, really tough mural about lynching that he made in Mexico that no longer exists. But this was the end of sort of that. He kept drawing, but he really primarily turned to sculpture. So I will end with that.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Kind of ran a lot.
Yes. Well, I don't know if it's been officially announced yet, so I don't know that I can say. But it's going to be on the East Coast, I can tell you that.
Yeah, because until all the ink is dry, no one's allowed to say, so.
And I'm not even quite sure of the dates, so, but stay tuned.
Any other
Anybody
questions?
else?
Covered a lot of ground in a lot of ways, so.
way back at the beginning, you mentioned repeatedly the challenges of storage, but I would think works on paper would be easy peasy.
Well, you did notice I did say these are 7 feet tall, right? Yeah, no. Our artists are working increasing. I mean, there are a lot of big works. The 2 installation works that are here are a good example. But also just, over the years, I mean, we have a lot to, and so trying to think responsibly about how do we can't collect everything. Right. But we want to be able to collect so that we are representing moments in history to the best of our ability.
Well, and I also want to just point out, she said it's, what, 160,000?
Yeah, well, something like 100,
So
well, we have about 120,000.
Think of a flat file. How many prints can you get in a flat file? And now you have 160,000 prints that you have to store in an archival and proper way.
Well, and some have to be framed.
And some have to be framed because they're too fragile. And so once you start compounding, okay, I can maybe get 150 prints in this bank of flat files. Now, how many banks of flat files do I need? And there's been times where I've had work that I'm preparing to sell to an institution, and they've said, we're going to buy it, we have the money, but it might take us 6 months to figure out where we can put it because it was an oversized print. And one time I had a sale go through only because the maps department at the Library of Congress vacated a set of flat files that was big enough to put the work in, and it was a gift. It was a major gift that they would not have been able to accept had that particular thing not happened, because otherwise it's now we have to buy a new bank of flat files. We're going to spend
Is there room
$5,000,
for it?
$7,000 if we have a spot to put that so we can have this work. And it's the woe of every sculptor I've ever met in my life, because if an institution buys a sculpture, they have to be able to store it forever. And if it's huge and they don't have a spot to keep it on permanent display, that means it's going somewhere. And so storage it's the burden of collecting. And I think anyone here who has a big collection at home understands that the burden of collecting. So for institutions, yeah, sometimes you have to, and when a gift comes in, that also has to come with insurance or storage money. Because it becomes another thing on the line. So
well, and we have to take care of them responsibly. I mean, these are color crayon and charcoal. You can't stack those in a drawer. They have to stay framed all the time. And so we have to think about things like, and some of them have to be stored on screens that don't move. If they are framed, we have to store them in such a way that they're on something that's stable, like a wall that they're hung on a wall that can't move, because if it's on a moving screen, you're going like this and it's vibrating. So there are a lot of nuances to all of this.
And because not every artist works with the most archival materials, and so sometimes these substrates are super fragile, and it becomes, I have people come to me all the time and be like, is there any way to fix this? And it's like literally falling apart in their fingers. And I was like, no.
Well, one thing that's important for people interested in collecting modern and contemporary prints, anything from the 20th century, is screen prints, which people think of as, primarily like a commercial kind of thing. It has those kinds of origins, and they're very durable. They're probably one of the most fragile printmaking techniques of any, maybe except dry point, or mezzotint, because any scuff, you drag any piece of paper over it and it will scuff, and then that beautiful flat blue, saturated blue, is no longer flat and beautiful and saturated. It has a scuff in the middle of it, which ruins the sort of effect of the design.
And it's virtually impossible to fix, just for anyone who knows out there.
Because if you try to cover it up, then you see the spot where you covered it up. It's like, so people often don't realize that.
Yeah, so there's
now
a
we
lot
got really into the mundane.
Yeah, a lot of challenges for us as practitioners too, because one of the things we're focused on is where it goes afterwards. And I always say your job as a printer is to get it out in the world and never have it come home. Like, it should never come back to you, because if it comes back to you, it's a problem, right? It had some sort of issue. So our job is to send it out and make sure that it can last for as long as it can, because we put all this effort into helping ensure the longevity of that artist's voice, because we have a great deal of respect for that work and respect for that artist. And so in turn, we also want to be able to make it easier to be collected, because we want it to be part of that larger conversation. So, sometimes artists themselves are generally more focused on the work and the next thing and the next thing. It's like, oh, I got to have this next idea. And so fortunately, when they work with printers, there's an opportunity for someone to say, well, we can make it in a way that will last, versus that beautiful impression on newsprint, which anyone who's ever made a print on newsprint understands, but that will never last. So we always are trying to find that balance of maintaining creative curiosity, but making sure that it can also withstand the test of time to be part of the longer arc conversation of growth of culture. So.
Well, thank you for
Thanks, guys.
hanging in there.
These are so nice.